In the last video, we saw that making a new provider creates a separate pipe of information. So we put down two providers, and each of these user creates got a different value over the context object. If we then placed a user create without any provider wrapping it, it only got the default value. So now that we have a better idea of how a provider behaves, we're going to start to look at one last feature around context. I'm going to first begin by cleaning up the extra provider and user create that we had placed inside of our app.js file. Okay, so I'm left with just the value coming from this.state.language right here. So the last thing we're going to take a look at around context is the second way of getting information out of this pipe of sorts. We've already taken a look at the first way of getting information out. We saw that we could set up that context type property, and then we got access to our data on the property this.context inside of a component. So the second way that we can consume information out of a pipe is by creating a consumer component. This consumer component is somewhat similar to the provider component that we just took a look at. The consumer is created for us automatically when we create a new context object. So if you recall, just a little bit ago, we console logged out the create context call right here, and we saw that the object that got returned had both a provider and a consumer property. So that consumer property is a React component that we can use to get information out of our pipe. To figure out how to use the consumer, we're going to open up our button.js file. Inside of button.js, we're going to refactor this thing to get information out of our context object by using a consumer instead of this.context approach. So inside of button.js, I'm going to first clean up the context type declaration right here. When we are using a consumer, we do not have to specify a context type. Context type is only required when we want to get our data assigned to the this.context property. So I'm going to clean up the context type inside of class button. Next up, we're going to wrap this text right here with a new consumer component. To do so, I'm going to clean up the const text declaration up here. I'm then going to turn my button component, or the return statement, into a multi-line JSX expression like so. I'm then going to remove the curly braces text right there, and I'm going to replace it with a new component, our consumer component. So I'm going to reference inside of here language context.consumer. Like so. Whenever we place a consumer, we always provide one argument to it, or kind of one child, I should say. We can think of this almost as being an argument, but it's really technically a child that we are passing into the consumer. This one child is always going to be a function. So inside of a set of curly braces, I'm going to place a function like so. This function is going to be automatically called by the consumer, and it's going to be called with whatever current value is inside of our pipe. That value is going to show up as the first argument inside of this arrow function right here. Now, this is the first time that we've ever seen something like this in React before. We are providing a function as a child to a React component. That component is going to take that child function and automatically invoke it for us. So this value right here is going to be whatever value is currently inside of the pipe. So inside of this function alone, only inside of this function, can we get access to that value and use it to decide what we want to print out. In this case, we're going to implement the same logic we had before, where we're going to compare the value to the string English. If value is equal to the string English, then I want to return submit. Otherwise, I'll put down my colon over here and we'll do vorlegen, or exactly, how do you spell that? I keep forgetting. Here it is, vorlegen, 2 G's. That's better. All right, so there's the entire line right there. So again, anytime we make use of a consumer to get a value out of that pipe or that context object, we're going to pass in a single function as a child. That child will be called with whatever value is inside of our pipe. So we can implement some logic inside of here. Now, one thing I want to mention is that if you have some logic you want to place inside of here that ends up being kind of complex, you could always define a helper method on your class. So I could do something like, I don't know, how about render submit? And then we could call this with our value, and then we can return the result of value equals English submit or vorlegen, like so. And then we could call that from this inner function. So I could call this .render submit and pass in the value like so. All right, let's try saving this and seeing what happens. So I'll save the file. I'm going to flip back over to my application. I still see the default of name and submit. And then if I click on the other flag, I'll see the translation as well. So again, this is another way of getting information out of one of these context objects, very similar to this.context. Remember, when we use the this.context approach, we also have to set up that context type, but we do not have to do that if we are making use of the consumer approach. Now, the most obvious question that you probably have right now is, why would we do this? Why would we take this approach as opposed to using that context type approach? Well, let's take a quick pause right here. When we come back to the next section, I'll tell you why we would want to use a consumer in place of that context type approach. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.